Welcome to my first ever myth chapter. I am so excited. This is such an exciting particular myth, but the way they wrote this, it's from this book called Myths That Every Child Should Know, a selection of classic myths of all time for young people. And the way I think of it is we should all know these myths. They're so exciting. There's so much imagination. Oh, sorry, my hands. That's okay. So much imagination, so much lessons that we can learn our whole life and use and talk to people about because they're classic. This book was actually copywritten in 1906. And, oh my gosh, it's really exciting. The first one that I'm going to read, a part of it today, is called The Three Golden Apples. And this was edited, because I like to give people credit, edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie, M-A-B-I-E. And it is illustrated, although you won't see those, I guess I'm the illustration, by Blanche Ostertag, New York. Doubleday Page and Company, 1906. So let's get started with this awesome story of the Three Golden Apples. And let's just get going. The Three Golden Apples. Did you ever hear of the golden apples that grew in the garden of the Hesperides? Ha ha, those were such apples as would bring a great price by the bushel if any of them could be found growing in the orchards of nowadays. But there is not, I suppose, even a graft of that wonderful fruit on a single tree in the wide world. Not so much as a seed of those apples exists any longer. And even in the half-forgotten old times before the Garden of the Hesperides was overrun with weeds, a great many people doubted whether there could be real trees that bore apples of solid gold upon their branches. All had heard of them, but nobody remembered to have seen any. Children, nevertheless, used to listen open-mouthed to stories of the golden apple tree and resolve to discover it when they should be big enough. Adventurous young men who desired to do a braver thing than any of their fellows set out in quest of this fruit. Many of them returned no more. None of them brought back the apples. No wonder that they found it impossible to gather them. It is said that there was a dragon beneath the tree with 100 terrible heads, 50 of which were always on the watch, while the other 50 slept. In my opinion, it was hardly worth running so much a risk for the sake of a solid golden apple. Had the apples been sweet, mellow, and juicy, indeed that would be another matter. There might then have been some sense in trying to get at them in spite of the 100-headed dragon. But as I have already told you, it was quite a common thing with young persons, when tired of too much peace and rest, to go in search of the Garden of the Hesperides. And once the adventure was undertaken by a hero who had enjoyed very little peace or rest since he came into the world. At the time of which I'm going to speak, he was wandering through the pleasant land of Italy with a mighty club in his hand, a bow and quiver slung across his shoulders. He was wrapped in the skin of the biggest and fiercest lion that had ever been seen and which he himself had killed. And though on the whole he was kind and generous and noble, there was a good deal of the lion's fierceness in his heart. As he went on his way, he continually inquired whether that were the right road to the famous garden or that, but none of the country people knew anything about the matter, and many looked as if they would have laughed at the question if the stranger had not carried such a very big club. So he journeyed on and on, still making the same inquiry, until at last he came to the brink of a river where some beautiful young women sat twining wreaths of flowers. "Can you tell me, pretty maidens," asked the stranger, "whether this is the right way to the Garden of Hesperides?" The young women had been having a fine time together, weaving the flowers into wreaths and crowning one another's heads, and there seemed to be a kind of magic in the touch of their fingers, that they would make the flowers with their fingers, just touching them, more fresh and dewy, and of brighter hues and sweeter fragrance, that when they played with them, they were brighter than even when they had been growing on their native stems. But on hearing the stranger's question, they dropped all their flowers on the grass and gazed at him with astonishment. "The Garden of the Hesperides?" cried one. "We thought mortals had been weary of seeking it after so many disappointments. And pray, adventurous traveler, what do you want to do there?" "A certain king, who is my cousin," replied he, "has ordered me to get him 3 of the golden apples." "Most of the young men who go in quest of these apples," observed another of the damsels, "desire to obtain them for themselves, or to present them to some fair maiden whom they love. Do you, then, love this king, your cousin, so very much?" "Perhaps not," replied the stranger, sighing. "He has often been severe and cruel to me, but it is my destiny to obey him." "And do you know," asked the damsel who had first spoken, "that a terrible dragon with 100 heads keeps watch under the golden apple tree?" "I know it well," answered the stranger calmly. "But from my cradle upward it has been my business and almost my pastime to deal with serpents and dragons." The young women looked at his massive club and at the shaggy lion skin which he wore, and likewise at his heroic limbs and figure, and they whispered to each other that stranger seemed to be one who might reasonably expect to perform deeds far beyond the might of other men. But then the dragon with 100 heads. What mortal, even if he possessed 100 lives, could hope to escape the fangs of such a monster? So kind-hearted were the maidens that they could not bear to see this brave and handsome traveler attempt what was so very dangerous, and devote himself most probably to become a meal for the dragon's 100 ravenous mouths. "Go back," cried they all. "Go back to your own home. Your mother, beholding you safe and sound, will shed tears of joy. And what can she do more should you win so great a victory? No matter for the golden apples, no matter for the king, your cruel cousin. We do not wish the dragon with 100 heads to eat you up." The stranger seemed to grow impatient at these remonstrances. He carefully lifted his mighty club and let it fall upon a rock that lay half buried in the earth nearby. With the force of that idle blow, the great rock was shattered all to pieces. It cost the stranger no more effort to achieve this feat of a giant's strength than for one of the young maidens to touch her sister's rosy cheek with a flower. "Do you not believe," said he, looking at the damsels with a smile, "that such a blow would have crushed one of the dragon's 100 heads?" Then he sat down on the grass and told them the story of his life, or as much of it as he could remember, from the day when he was first cradled in a warrior's brazen shield. While he lay there, 2 immense serpents came gliding over the floor and opened their hideous jaws to devour him. And he, a baby of only a few months old, had gripped one of the fierce snakes in each of his little fists and strangled them to death when he was just a stripling, then he had killed a huge lion almost as big as the one whose vast and shaggy hide he now wore upon his shoulders. And the next thing that he had done was to fight a battle with an ugly sort of monster called a hydra, which had no less than 9 heads and exceedingly sharp teeth in every one. But the dragon of the Hesperides, you know, observed one of the damsels, has 100 heads. Nevertheless, replied the stranger, I would rather fight 2 such dragons than a single hydra. For as fast as I could cut off a head, 2 others grew in its place, and besides, there was one of the heads that could not possibly be killed, but kept biting as fiercely as ever long after I had cut it off. So I was forced to bury it under a stone, where it is doubtless alive to this very day. But the hydra's body and its 8 other heads will never do any further mischief. The damsels, judging that the story was likely to last a good while, had been preparing a repast of bread and grapes, that the stranger might refresh himself in the intervals of his talk. They took pleasure in helping him to this simple food, and now and then one of them would put a sweet grape between her rosy lips, lest it should make him bashful to eat alone.